She touched my arm and smiled like she'd been waiting for me all along. And suddenly, the office felt like the most dangerous place to fall in love. The first time I saw her, I wasn't prepared for how quietly magnetic she would be. I had entered the office expecting the usual sterile, professional hum. The low murmur of keyboards, the faint smell of coffee, the occasional ring of a phone. Everything seemed ordinary, almost mundane, until she appeared. She was at the reception desk, straightening a stack of papers with precise movements that seemed effortless, yet deliberate, as if even the smallest gestures carried weight. Her hair was pinned neatly, a few loose strands softening the sharp lines of her professional attire. I remember thinking how graceful she looked, her presence somehow filling the room without a single word. She looked older than me, perhaps in her early 40s, but there was an energy about her that made her approachable, confident, yet quietly vulnerable. It was magnetic, and I immediately felt my pulse shift. When it was time for me to be seated, she gestured toward a chair across from her desk. But then, in a moment I'll never forget, she reached out and lightly brushed her fingers along my forearm, leaning slightly closer. "I like this seat better," she said with a soft, knowing smile. Her voice was calm, warm, almost teasing in the gentlest way. The brush of her hand sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. A small, electric shock that seemed too intimate for a first encounter, yet it felt entirely natural. I noticed the subtle details, the faint warmth of her skin, the slight pressure of her touch, the way her eyes lingered on me for a heartbeat longer than necessary. I realized then that she had a way of making ordinary moments feel important, even charged, without ever seeming intrusive. Her smile carried a quiet confidence, but also something else, a spark of curiosity, an unspoken invitation to step beyond formality. I sat down, feeling a mix of awkwardness and fascination. My mind raced with thoughts I hadn't expected. Her professionalism, her poise, the faint scent of her perfume that lingered around her like a gentle halo. There was no overt flirtation, no grand gesture. Only the simple, deliberate brush of her hand and that soft, lingering smile. And yet, somehow it was enough. The rest of the room faded slightly, and I found myself hyper-aware of every small sound. The distant hum of the air conditioning, the faint tap of a keyboard, the quiet shuffle of papers. Even the ordinary noises seemed amplified, as if they were background to this subtle, magnetic presence. My attention was entirely on her, though I struggled to articulate why, even to myself. By the time our interaction ended, I realized I was already looking forward to the next moment, the next subtle brush of her hand, the next quiet smile. Something about her had awakened a curiosity I hadn't felt in years, a sense of possibility that felt both thrilling and precarious. The office, in all its normalcy, had become the setting for something quietly extraordinary, the beginning of a story I hadn't yet imagined, but already wanted to explore. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing her more than I expected. At first, it was small things, the way she moved with quiet confidence, the graceful way she handled the endless stream of office paperwork, the soft rustle of her blouse as she leaned over a desk. There was a rhythm to her presence, a subtle harmony that seemed to sync with the beat of the office itself. And somehow, I kept finding myself drawn into it. She seemed to appear just as I was settling into my routine. Whether it was bringing in a cup of coffee or arranging files near my desk, she moved with an effortless poise that was almost mesmerizing. I caught myself anticipating these moments, the way a small thrill rises before something familiar yet intimate. One morning, as she passed my desk to place a folder in front of me, her hand lightly brushed against my forearm. It was fleeting, almost accidental, yet the warmth lingered in my skin long after she had moved away. A quiet tension hummed under the surface, subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. It wasn't just the touches. It was the glances. Sometimes, I'd look up to find her observing something I was doing, her expression thoughtful and warm. She wouldn't stare. There was no awkwardness, just a gentle, steady attention that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. I began noticing the little details, the curve of her lips when she smiled, the faint glint in her eyes when she caught me off guard. The way her presence seemed to make the hum of the office feel softer, almost comforting. Even ordinary interactions became charged with subtle intimacy. A question about a report or a clarification on a schedule carried a quiet electricity simply because of her proximity. When she handed me a stack of papers, her fingers briefly lingered near mine, the warmth of her skin brushing against me in a moment that lasted just long enough to feel meaningful. I was hyper-aware of the faint scent of her perfume, the soft cadence of her voice as she spoke. Every interaction, no matter how mundane, carried an emotional weight I couldn't ignore. And yet, everything remained within the bounds of professionalism. She never crossed a line. Every movement and glance was graceful, measured. That balance only made her presence more tantalizing, more magnetic. It was as if she understood exactly how to be close without pushing too far, how to make me notice her without ever speaking a word of intention. By the end of the week, I realized that I looked forward to her presence more than I expected. The office, once a neutral space, had begun to feel warmer, more alive. Every brush of her hand, every lingering glance, every subtle smile built a tension that was quietly exhilarating. I found myself thinking about her long after leaving, replaying the small moments that seemed almost insignificant on the surface but carried an intimacy I couldn't shake. Her presence was no longer just part of the office background. It had become a force, gentle but undeniable. And I understood, with a sudden clarity, that this attraction, delicate, respectful, and unspoken, was just beginning. As the days passed, the quiet tension between us began to take shape. It was never overt, never bold, but there was a rhythm emerging, a delicate dance of attention and restraint. The office remained professional, yet the moments we shared carried a gentle spark that made ordinary interactions feel unexpectedly significant. It started with small jokes, little shared moments that seemed trivial at the time but lingered long after. One afternoon, as I fumbled with a stack of files, she leaned over with a soft chuckle, her hand briefly brushing against mine as she steadied the papers. "Careful, these are delicate," she said, her tone teasing but kind. The warmth of her touch remained after she pulled back, and I caught myself smiling at the memory of it later, my heart quietly alert to her presence. Her attention was deliberate but never imposing. Across the office, I'd catch her glancing in my direction, eyes meeting mine for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. It wasn't a stare, it was a subtle acknowledgement, a silent conversation without words. I began to recognize the small signals, the tilt of her head when she listened intently, the slight shift in posture that brought her a fraction closer when she stood beside me, the soft inflection in her voice that made a routine question feel unusually personal. One day, we were reviewing a report together, leaning over the same desk. Our elbows touched lightly as we pointed at a paragraph, and I felt a quiet rush of warmth. She looked up, her gaze meeting mine, and held it with a patience that was both soothing and exhilarating. I realized I was hyper-aware of every detail. The faint scent of her perfume that lingered in the air between us, the soft fabric of her blouse brushing against my arm, the subtle rhythm of her breathing. There was intimacy here, unspoken yet profoundly present, and it made every ordinary office task feel charged with meaning. Despite the growing tension, everything remained within playful, respectful bounds. She tested the line with gentle teasing, a comment on my concentration, a small smile at an offhand remark, but she never crossed it. That careful balance only made our interactions more compelling. It was a slow, deliberate flirtation, one built on nuance and attentiveness, on knowing how close to come without breaking the rhythm of professionalism. By the end of the week, I noticed a quiet anticipation in myself. I found myself looking forward to her jokes, her subtle touches, even the shared silences. Each encounter left a faint, lingering thrill, an emotional echo that followed me long after she had walked away. The office, once purely functional, had become a stage for an understated connection, a space where respect and desire coexisted in delicate equilibrium. Her presence had shifted from mere observation to something more, a quiet magnetism that drew me in, teaching me that attraction could be patient, gentle, and utterly compelling. In the slow, careful dance of playful boundaries, I realized that what we were building wasn't fleeting. It was a foundation, tentative, thrilling, and entirely real. It was a quiet afternoon, the hum of the office softened by the steady rhythm of typing and the occasional click of a keyboard. Most of our colleagues had already left, leaving a calm, almost private atmosphere that seemed to encourage honesty. She was reviewing some files near my desk, and I could sense a different energy in the room, a shift from playful boundaries to something more intimate, more revealing. She looked up at me and offered a small, almost shy smile. "I had a rough morning," she admitted, her voice low but warm. It wasn't dramatic or forced. It was simple, human. There was a pause, a soft hesitation before she continued. "Sometimes it feels like no matter how much I organize, something always slips through. I don't usually admit it, but today's one of those days." Her confession, quiet as it was, created an unexpected connection. I felt a rush of empathy, a desire to offer reassurance. Without thinking, I responded gently, leaning slightly closer, keeping my voice soft. "I understand. Everyone has those days. You handle so much, though. It's impressive how composed you stay." She smiled again, a little more genuinely this time, and I noticed the subtle shift in her posture. Her shoulders relaxed, her hands unclenching from the papers she had been gripping. There was a delicate trust forming in the air, fragile but undeniable. When she reached for a document on my desk, her fingers brushed against mine for just a moment longer than necessary. The warmth lingered on my skin, and I realized I was acutely aware of every small detail. The softness of her touch, the light scent of her perfume, the faint hum of her breathing. As we continued talking, I caught glimpses of vulnerability in her eyes, something beneath the confident exterior, a side of her rarely revealed to anyone. She wasn't seeking sympathy, only understanding, and I found myself wanting to provide that quiet presence, to be the person who could see her fully without judgment. The office felt smaller, more intimate, as if the space itself was urging us to acknowledge this new closeness. There were small, unspoken gestures that deepened the moment. She adjusted a stack of papers, her hand lingering on mine again, a casual touch that spoke volumes. She laughed softly at something I said, and the sound carried a warmth that felt personal, almost comforting. Even in silence, we shared an understanding, an acknowledgement that this connection was growing, delicate yet real. By the end of the afternoon, I realized that the playful tension of before had evolved into something more profound. I wasn't just noticing her presence or subtle touches anymore. I was attuned to her emotions, the quiet shifts in her mood, the moments of vulnerability she allowed me to witness. There was a bond forming, built on trust, attentiveness, and subtle intimacy. That day, I understood that attraction wasn't merely physical or fleeting. It could be quiet, emotionally charged, and deeply human. In her vulnerability, I saw strength, and in her confidence, I saw a longing that mirrored my own. The office, once just a place of work, had become a sanctuary for connection, and I found myself longing for more moments like this. Moments where trust and quiet intimacy intertwined in ways words alone could never express. It was one of those rare moments when the office was almost entirely quiet, the usual hum of activity reduced to a soft, comforting stillness. Most of our colleagues had left for the day, leaving only the two of us among the desks and softly glowing monitors. The subtle shift in the atmosphere made ordinary interactions feel charged, each sound, each movement amplified. We were working together on a project, leaning over the same set of documents, and the proximity was unavoidable. As I adjusted a sheet of paper, her hand lightly grazed my forearm. It was brief, casual, almost accidental, yet it sent a shiver of awareness up my spine. I noticed the warmth of her skin, the faint scent of her perfume, the way her fingers lingered just long enough to make the touch memorable. She glanced at me with a soft, knowing smile, the kind that seemed to hold unspoken words. "This seems easier with two heads," she said, her voice gentle but warm, her eyes catching mine in a fleeting, intimate pause. It wasn't just a comment on the work. There was something in her tone, a subtle acknowledgement of the closeness we were sharing. My heart thudded quietly, aware of the tension that had been building for days now. As we continued, we moved slightly closer to read the same lines, our elbows brushing more often than before. Each contact carried weight, light, respectful, and yet undeniably intimate. I became acutely aware of her presence beside me, the rhythm of her breathing, the small movements of her hands, the soft cadence of her voice as she explained her thoughts. It was as though the ordinary act of collaboration had transformed into a delicate dance of connection, a quiet intimacy that needed no words. At one point, she leaned over to point at a paragraph, and her shoulder nudged mine gently. My breath caught, not from surprise, but from the sudden realization that the space between us had shrunk in a way that felt natural, inevitable. Her warmth radiated subtly, a reassuring presence that made my own nervous awareness feel calmer and more attentive. For a brief moment, the world outside the office ceased to exist. It was just her and me, quietly navigating this new closeness. There was a softness in her gaze, a patient attentiveness that invited trust. When she laughed at a minor misstep I made, the sound was intimate, melodic, and entirely personal, filling the space between us in a way that made my chest tighten slightly. Even in silence, our connection spoke volumes, a gentle tension balanced with comfort, attraction tempered by respect. By the time the documents were finally in order, I realized something had shifted. Our interactions had evolved from fleeting touches and glances to a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the growing bond between us. The office, once a place of routine and professionalism, now felt like a private space where connection could blossom gently, almost imperceptibly. That evening, as she gathered her things to leave, her hand brushed mine one last time, light, deliberate, yet unassuming. The warmth lingered long after she had gone, leaving me acutely aware of the quiet, growing intimacy between us. In that single, subtle moment, I understood that attraction didn't need grand gestures. It thrived in shared proximity, fleeting touches, and the slow accumulation of meaningful connection. The office was quiet again, but this time it wasn't the emptiness of the end of the day that created intimacy. It was a stillness that felt intentional, almost sacred, as if the world had paused for a moment meant only for the two of us. We had been collaborating on a project for weeks now, and the rhythm of our interactions had shifted from playful glances and fleeting touches to a deeper, almost unspoken understanding. She approached my desk with a folder in hand, her movements calm but purposeful. "Can we take a moment?" she asked softly, her tone different, more personal, more sincere. I nodded, my heartbeat quickening at the quiet gravity in her voice. She set the folder down but didn't return to her usual tasks. Instead, she leaned lightly against the edge of my desk, her presence close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her without it being overwhelming. "I've been meaning to say something," she began, pausing as if carefully choosing her words. "I enjoy our time together." There was no dramatic flourish, no exaggerated declaration, just a quiet honesty that carried weight far heavier than any words I had imagined. Her eyes met mine, steady and vulnerable, and I felt a subtle catch in my chest. The room seemed to shrink around us, the hum of the office fading into background silence, leaving only the shared space between us. She continued, her hand brushing against mine as she gestured toward the folder. It was casual yet deliberate, a gentle affirmation of the connection that had grown between us. "I appreciate how you notice the little things," she said. "The way you pay attention, even to things no one else sees. It means more than I expected." I found myself leaning slightly closer, my own voice soft, mirroring the intimacy of the moment. "I feel the same," I admitted, the words simple but true. "I look forward to seeing you." To moments like this. You make the office feel different, warmer, more alive. The corners of her lips curved into a small, genuine smile, and I felt a quiet thrill ripple through me. There was a long pause, filled only by the subtle rhythm of our breathing and the faint tick of a clock somewhere in the background. Every detail of her presence, the warmth of her hand, the gentle lilt in her voice, the softness of her expression, became impossible to ignore. We were close without touching, connected without overt action, and the tension that had been building for weeks settled into something tender and real. Finally, she gave a quiet laugh, almost self-conscious, yet entirely sincere. "I'm glad we're honest with each other," she said. Her hand lingered near mine, just brushing my fingers for a heartbeat longer before she pulled back. Even that small contact felt significant, a delicate bridge between desire and respect. By the end of the conversation, we had acknowledged something neither of us could ignore any longer. There was no rush, no dramatic leap, only the quiet affirmation of feelings that had been growing slowly, carefully, over time. The office, once a space of routine and distance, had transformed into a place where trust and attraction could coexist, subtle yet undeniable. And in that shared acknowledgement, I realized that our story, slow, deliberate, and filled with quiet intimacy, was finally ready to move forward. The office had grown quiet, the golden light of late afternoon streaming through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the desks. There was a warmth in the air, subtle and comforting, a reflection of the bond that had slowly taken root between us over the past weeks. The playful glances, fleeting touches, and quiet confidences had matured into something deeper, a mutual understanding that felt both natural and extraordinary. She walked toward my desk carrying a small stack of papers, her movements calm and effortless, yet each gesture seemed imbued with a gentle significance. When she reached me, she set the papers down but lingered for a moment, just close enough for me to notice the warmth of her presence. Our eyes met, and I felt the familiar flutter of awareness, tempered now by familiarity and trust. The tension that had once been exhilarating had softened into something tender, a quiet anticipation that didn't need words. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly, her hand brushing mine briefly as she handed me a pen. The contact was casual, yet deliberate, a lingering warmth that carried more meaning than 1,000 words could convey. I caught her glance, subtle and deliberate, and for a moment the world outside the office seemed to fade. I noticed every detail, the delicate curve of her smile, the calm steadiness in her posture, the faint glimmer in her eyes that betrayed both confidence and vulnerability. We began to review the papers together, our elbows occasionally touching, a comfortable closeness that no longer carried the sharp edge of tension, but instead felt natural and reassuring. When she laughed at a minor mistake of mine, the sound was soft, intimate, and entirely personal. The warmth of that shared moment settled into my chest, leaving a quiet, steady contentment in its wake. After a pause, she shifted slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her hand lingered for a heartbeat near my shoulder before retreating, a subtle, tender gesture that spoke volumes about our connection. I realized then that we had reached a point where physical closeness and emotional intimacy coexisted effortlessly. Our interactions no longer required conscious restraint. They flowed naturally, grounded in mutual respect, care, and the quiet acknowledgement of feelings long in the making. As she prepared to leave for the day, she gave me a soft, knowing smile. Her hand brushed mine once more, gentle and unassuming, a small farewell that left warmth lingering on my skin. "See you tomorrow," she said, her tone light yet meaningful. I nodded, my own smile reflecting the depth of understanding between us. In that simple exchange, there was no need for dramatic confessions or grand gestures. Only the quiet affirmation of a connection that had grown slowly, deliberately, and entirely authentically. I watched her walk away, feeling a steady calm, a gentle excitement for what was to come. The office, once a place of routine, had become a sanctuary for a bond that was respectful, tender, and undeniably real. I knew that our story, slow, careful, and full of quiet intimacy, was only beginning, yet it was complete in its own way. The flutter of attraction, the warmth of touch, the shared laughter and vulnerability had all found their resolution, leaving behind a steady, glowing connection that promised more moments like these, simple, meaningful, and entirely ours. If this slow burn story of unexpected connection and quiet romance resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more age gap romance tales. Comment below which moment in the story made your heart skip a beat.